It was Christmas Eve. I sat at the table with my arm in a cast, unable to even hold a fork. I watched my own daughter smile while she whispered without a shred of shame, "Mom, my husband only taught you the lesson you deserved." My son-in-law at her side let out a cold laugh. It was the laugh of a man who believes he controls everything and everyone inside this house. Less than an hour later, the doorbell rang. He went to open it full of that same arrogance as always, but as soon as he saw who was at the door, his face went pale and his hands started to tremble. But before we continue, make sure you are subscribed to the channel Elderly Stories and write in the comments, where are you watching this video from? We love knowing how far our stories travel. The smell of Christmas turkey floated in the air like an empty promise of happiness. It was Christmas Eve, and the table was set with the white embroidered tablecloth my mother left me as an inheritance. It was the same one I used for every Christmas over the last 40 years. The candles flickered softly, reflecting in the crystal glasses and the porcelain plates that my late husband George and I bought on our honeymoon in Hawaii. Everything seemed perfect, everything except the heavy and uncomfortable cast that immobilized my right arm. My name is Catherine. I am 72 years old. Until that night, I believed that family meant protection. I believed blood ties were sacred. I believed a daughter would never be capable of destroying her own mother. How wrong I was. I looked at my plate. Empty. Completely empty. In front of me, the golden turkey exhaled its tempting aroma, surrounded by mashed potatoes, stuffing cranberry salad, and all the delicacies that I myself had bought and partially prepared before the accident. But I could not serve myself. My right hand was trapped in that rough cast, and my left hand, trembling from age and shock, could not reach the platters in the center of the table. Richard, my son-in-law, occupied the head of the table, the place that always belonged to George. He chewed loudly, shoving huge bites into his mouth with turkey grease dripping down his chin. His small, calculating eyes watched me with a glint of satisfaction that gave me nausea. "Aren't you hungry, mother-in-law?" he asked with his mouth full, a malicious smile distorting his thin lips. "Or is it hard for you to eat with only one hand?" My daughter Michelle, sitting beside him, let out a stifled giggle. She wore a red dress that was too tight for her age, and her hair dyed blonde was beginning to show dark roots. She did not look me in the eyes. She hadn't looked at me since it all happened. The accident. That is what they called it. As if my arm had broken itself. As if I had tripped and fallen because of a clumsy old woman's carelessness. But it was not an accident. It happened 3 days ago. Richard had arrived at my house without warning, as he always did lately. Since George died 2 years ago, he and Michelle came to visit me with suspicious frequency. At first I was happy. I thought they were worried about me. I thought they wanted to keep me company. What a fool I was. The visits always ended the same way, with Richard talking about how big this house was for a single woman, how dangerous it would be for me to keep living here, how wonderful the nursing homes were where I would have company and medical care. "You need to think about the future," he would say, with that rehearsed tone of voice he used to sound concerned. "If something happens to you, who is going to help you? Michelle and I work all day. We cannot come running here every moment." I always gave the same answer. This house was my home. I raised my daughter here. I lived here for 45 years with George. All my memories were here, my furniture, my rose garden that I tended to every day. I was not going anywhere. But 3 days ago, Richard lost his patience. He arrived with a folder full of papers, contracts, deeds, documents I did not understand well. He said it was to simplify things to protect me from scammers. I just had to sign here, here, and here, and he would take care of everything. I asked to see the papers calmly. I said I would show them to my lawyer first. That was when his eyes changed. That shine of fake sympathy disappeared, replaced by something cold and cruel. "Listen to me well, old woman," he hissed, stepping closer to me. "You are going to sign these papers. You are going to transfer this house to Michelle's name. You are going to stop the drama and understand once and for all that you are no longer in charge of anything." I stepped back instinctively. My heart raced. I knew men like this. George had warned me about Richard from the beginning. "That boy is greedy," he used to tell me. "Be careful with him, Catherine." But Michelle was in love, and I, like any mother, gave in. I let them get married. I helped pay for the wedding, the down payment on their condo, the bills, when Richard lost his third job. I always thought I was investing in my daughter's happiness. That afternoon when I refused to sign, Richard lunged. There was no warning. There was no hesitation. He simply shoved me with all his strength against the doorframe of the kitchen. I heard the crack before I felt the pain, a dry, horrible sound, like a branch snapping. My right arm, which I raised instinctively to protect myself, took the entire impact. The pain was so intense that for a moment I could not even scream. I just slid down the wall to the floor, holding my deformed arm against my chest. Michelle was in the living room. She saw. She heard. I knew she had seen because I heard her footsteps approaching. "Mom," she called, stopping at the kitchen door. I lifted my eyes toward her, hoping for help, hoping my daughter would run to me, help me call an ambulance, hoping she would confront her husband, scream at him, do something. But Michelle just looked at Richard. Then she looked at me. And then she said words that will be etched in my memory until the day I die. "Mom, why can't you simply cooperate? Do you see what happened because of you? There was no ambulance." Richard ripped the cords out of the landline and confiscated my cell phone. He said I would stay there thinking until I came to my senses. He locked the front door and took Michelle with him. I spent the night on the kitchen floor with my broken arm throbbing, unable to move. The pain was so great I lost consciousness a few times. When dawn broke, I had a fever and the shakes. It was my neighbor, Mrs. Linda, who found me. She thought it was strange not to see me watering the plants in the morning and came to check. She forced the back door open with the help of her grandson and took me to the hospital. In the emergency room, I said I had fallen, that I tripped on the kitchen rug. The doctors looked at me with that expression that said they did not believe me, but they did not insist. They put a cast on my arm and sent me home. When Michelle appeared at the hospital, she cried. She hugged me, asking for forgiveness, saying she hadn't understood the gravity of the situation, that Richard was nervous about work, that it would never happen again. And I, the foolish old woman that I am, believed her. That is why I was there on Christmas Eve with a broken arm and an empty plate, watching my son-in-law devour the food I had bought while my daughter pretended nothing had happened. "Richard," I said, my voice coming out weaker than I would like, "could you pass me a little turkey, please?" He stopped chewing. He looked at me with that cruel smile I already knew well. "Excuse me, mother-in-law, I didn't hear you well. What did you say?" "The turkey," I repeated, trying to maintain my dignity. "I cannot reach the platters." Richard exchanged a look with Michelle. Some silent message passed between them, something that excluded me completely. "Do you know what the problem is, Mrs. Catherine?" he said, wiping his mouth with the linen napkin. "The napkin that belonged to my wedding trousseau. You still haven't learned your place in this house." The silence that followed Richard's words was so thick I could hear the ticking of the wall clock in the living room. It was the grandfather clock George inherited from his father, an antique piece of dark mahogany that marked the hours with almost terrifying precision. I looked at my daughter, waiting for some reaction. Anything. A word in my defense, a look of disapproval toward her husband, a minimal gesture that showed she was still the girl I raised with so much love. Michelle kept eating with her head down as if I did not exist. "Michelle," I called, my voice trembling, "are you not going to say anything?" She lifted her eyes slowly. There was something in that look I did not recognize, a coldness, a calculated indifference that froze my blood. "Mom," she said, putting down her silverware with a sigh of impatience, "Richard is right. You must understand that things have changed. Dad died and you are getting older. You can't keep bossing everyone around believing you are still in control of the situation." I felt as if I had been slapped. In fact, a slap would have hurt less. "Daughter, what are you talking about?" "This is my house. I built all of this together with your father. Every piece of furniture, every brick, every memory." "That is exactly the problem," interrupted Richard, leaning back in George's chair as if he were the lord of the castle. "You live in the past. You stay there, clinging to these old things, to this rotting furniture, to this house that is falling to pieces. Do you know how much it costs to maintain a property of this size? Do you know how much this land is worth?" I did know. I knew perfectly well. This house was located in one of the most high-value neighborhoods in the city. The lot was large and worth a fortune. That was why they wanted to get rid of me so badly. "Richard," I said, trying to keep calm despite the trembling in my hands. "I already said I am not going to sell this house. I will not go to any nursing home, and I am not going to sign any document to pass my assets to you while I am alive." He leaned forward, elbows on the table, his face a few inches from mine. "And who said you have a choice?" It was Michelle who spoke next, and her words destroyed me more than any physical blow. "Mom, listen to me. Richard is right. You are getting older, confused. You forget things. You repeat the same stories 1,000 times. Just yesterday you left the stove on." "I did not leave any stove on," I protested, feeling indignation rise in my throat. "You see," Michelle looked at her husband, shaking her head as if I were a problem child. "She doesn't even remember. It is exactly what I was telling you. It was a lie. It was all a lie. I had never left the stove on in my life. But I realized in that moment what they were doing. They were building a case, planting seeds of doubt, preparing the ground for the next step, legal guardianship. That was what they wanted. They would declare that I was incapable of taking care of myself, of managing my assets. Michelle would become my legal guardian, and then she could do whatever she wanted with everything George and I built over a lifetime. "Michelle," I said, my voice firmer, now strengthened by the rage that was beginning to replace the fear. "Your father spent 45 years of his life working to build all of this. He got up at 5 in the morning. He drove that delivery truck on dirt roads. He carried boxes until his back couldn't take it anymore. Do you think he did all that so you could sell it and spend it on your husband's debts?" Richard slammed the table with the palm of his hand. The plates shook, the wine in my glass untouched, agitated dangerously. "Shut up, old woman," he shouted. "You don't know what you're talking about. My debts are investments, businesses that are going to bear fruit. You don't understand anything about money. You never understood. You spent your whole life depending on your husband, and now you want to give us lessons." I took a deep breath. The pain in my arm throbbed in unison with the beating of my heart, but I was not going to cry. I was not going to give them that pleasure. "I know very well what I am talking about, Richard. I know you lost your job 8 months ago and didn't tell Michelle. I know you are 3 months behind on the condo rent. I know you owe more than $50,000 in credit cards and personal loans." His face turned red. His nostrils flared. Michelle looked at her husband with an expression of surprise that confirmed my suspicions. She didn't know even half of it. "Where did you get that lie?" Richard hissed between his teeth. "It is not a lie. You dropped a bank statement from your folder last month when you came here to try and convince me to sell the house for the first time. I read it. I know everything." There was a moment of absolute silence. Richard looked at me with a hatred so intense I felt a chill run down my spine. Michelle looked at her husband as if she were seeing him for the first time. "Richard," she said in a low voice, "what is she talking about? Did you lose your job?" "Shut up, Michelle," he growled, not taking his eyes off me. "That is none of your business. I handle the finances, you know that. But you said you got a raise." I said, "Shut up." His scream made Michelle shrink into her chair. I saw the same fear I felt reflected in my daughter's eyes, and for a moment I felt pity for her. She was also a victim of this man. She was also trapped in a web she didn't know how to escape. But then Michelle did something that killed any trace of compassion I might still have had. She turned toward me, her eyes hard as stones, and said, "Mom, Richard gave you the lesson you deserved. If you had cooperated from the beginning, none of this would have happened. The fault is yours. It has always been yours." I closed my eyes for a moment. The pain in my arm seemed insignificant next to the pain those words caused in my heart. My own daughter, the girl I nursed, who I rocked when she had a fever, who I walked to school by the hand. That girl was dead. In her place was a stranger looking at me as if I were an obstacle that needed to be removed. When I opened my eyes again, something had changed inside me. The sadness was still there, but it had been pushed into a corner, replaced by a cold and calculating determination. I had spent my entire life taking care of others, taking care of George when he got sick, taking care of Michelle when she was a child, a teenager, an adult, giving up my dreams, my desires, my time always putting family first. And this is how they repaid me. "You are right," I said, my voice surprisingly calm. "I am old, I am weak, I no longer have the strength to fight. I saw Richard's eyes light up with a gleam of victory. Michelle relaxed visibly in her chair. "Finally, you are being reasonable, Mrs. Catherine," he said, going back to eating as if nothing had happened. "Tomorrow we can go to the notary. I will resolve everything very quickly. You won't even have to worry. Just one thing," I said, looking at the wall clock. It was exactly 8 o'clock at night. In a few minutes the doorbell was going to ring. And when it rang, the lives of Richard and Michelle would never be the same again. What they didn't know, what nobody knew, is that George was not just a truck driver. George was a man who spent his whole life preparing for the worst. He built a safety net around me without me ever knowing. And that net was about to trigger. The ticking of the pendulum clock seemed louder and louder. Or maybe it was just my perception sharpened by expectation. I knew what was coming. I had made a call 2 days ago from the hospital when Michelle went out to get coffee and left me alone for 15 minutes. 15 minutes. That was all I needed. The number was etched in my memory for more than 20 years. George made me memorize it one winter night when we sat together on the porch and he told me secrets he had carried for decades. "Catherine," he told me that night holding my hands between his work-hardened ones, "if one day I am no longer here and you need real help, call this number. It doesn't matter the time, it doesn't matter the reason. Say you are the wife of George Montero. They will know what to do." I laughed in that moment. I thought it was an exaggeration of his, the paranoia of a man who spent his life on the road and saw too many things. But I memorized the number anyway, because George rarely asked me for anything. The night Richard threw me against the wall while I was on the kitchen floor with a broken arm, that number was the only thing I could think about. And 2 days later in the hospital, I finally dialed it. A male voice answered on the second ring. Deep, calm, authoritative. "Hello, this is Catherine," I said, my voice trembling. "Wife of George Montero." There was a pause. Then the voice on the other side changed completely. It became softer, almost affectionate. "Mrs. Catherine, it has been a long time. What has happened?" I told him everything. The broken arm, the threats, the pressure to sell the house, the indifference of my own daughter. I spoke without stopping for 10 minutes, words gushing out like water from a broken dam. When I finished, he only said, "Are you at the General Hospital?" "Yes, I am going to send someone there right now. And about the other situation, I will handle it personally. Do you trust me? I trust you," I answered without hesitation. "Then you return home, pretend nothing has happened, and wait. On Christmas Eve, exactly at 8 o'clock, sharp, someone will ring the doorbell of your house. Leave the rest in my hands." And that was how I found myself there sitting at the table of my own house, with an empty plate watching my son-in-law stuff himself while my daughter pretended everything was normal. 8:02. The clock struck twice. The doorbell rang. The sound resonated down the hallway like thunder in a clear sky. Richard stopped chewing his fork suspended in the air. Michelle looked toward the door with an expression of confusion. Who could that be at this hour trying to hide the anxiety in my voice? "Go open it, Richard." He shot me a suspicious look but got up from the chair, wiping his hands on the napkin. He walked toward the front door with heavy steps, clearly irritated by the interruption. I heard the door open. Then silence. A silence that was too long. Richard called Michelle, standing up too. "Who is it?" She walked toward the hallway, and I followed her with my eyes. From my spot at the dining table, I could partially see the entrance door. I could see Richard's back completely motionless, and I could see what was on the other side. 2 huge men dressed in black with military posture, and between them a shorter man with gray hair wearing an impeccable suit despite it being Christmas Eve. I recognized that man immediately. His face was in all the newspapers and all the television reports. He was the most powerful man in the state. The man who controlled the police, the justice system, the politics. The man who they said had built his empire on favors and unshakable loyalties. Judge Albert Ross, the Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court, and he was at the door of my house. "Good evening," he said, his deep voice filling the hallway. "I would like to speak with Mrs. Catherine." Richard could not move. His legs seemed nailed to the floor. Michelle behind him had her mouth open in an expression of pure shock. I got up from the table, feeling a strength I didn't know I still possessed. I walked toward the door, passing my petrified daughter, until I stood face to face with the man who had answered my call. "Albert," I said, using the name George always used when he spoke of him. His eyes, which transmitted absolute authority to the rest of the world, softened when he saw me. They descended to the cast on my arm, and something crossed his face, a shadow of controlled rage that made the two bodyguards straighten up automatically, Mrs. Catherine, he said, bowing his head slightly in a gesture of respect. George saved my life once. He never wanted me to pay that debt. But now, he looked at my arm again. Now I am going to pay. I felt tears burn my eyes, but I held them back. I was not going to cry, not in front of Richard and Michelle, not after everything they had done. Come in, please, I said, opening the door wider. I was having dinner. Alone practically, Albert entered, followed by the two men in black. Richard finally managed to move backing up against the wall, as if he wanted to merge with it and disappear. Judge, he stammered, trying to smile. What an honor. We didn't know my mother-in-law knew. I mean, what a pleasure to receive you. Albert didn't even look at him. He walked directly toward the dining room, observing the set table, the plates, the food. His eyes stopped at my spot on the completely empty plate. You haven't eaten, he stated, not as a question but as an accusation. I couldn't reach the platters, I responded simply. With my arm like this. I saw Albert's jaw clench. He turned toward Michelle, who had followed the group to the living room like a ghost, pale and trembling. Are you her daughter? He asked. Michelle nodded, unable to speak. And you let your mother go hungry in her own house on Christmas Eve. She didn't ask. She shouldn't need to ask, Albert cut in his voice sharp as a blade. She is your mother, the woman who brought you into the world, who raised you, who sacrificed everything for you. And you leave her hungry while you eat in front of her. Michelle opened her mouth to answer, but Albert had already turned away. He walked to the head of the table where Richard had been sitting and stood there looking at the chair as if it offended him personally. This was George's chair, he said in a low voice, more to himself than to anyone else in the room. Did you know my father? Michelle dared to ask. Albert finally looked at her, his eyes, which had been cold until then, filled with something that looked a lot like contempt. George saved my life 35 years ago. I was a young district attorney who had gone too far in an investigation. Certain people wanted to silence me. They were waiting for me on a deserted highway in the interior of the state. He paused. George was making a delivery out there. He saw what was happening. He could have kept driving, pretended it was none of his business. But he stopped. The truck got out and faced 3 armed men with nothing but a tire iron. I knew that story. George never told anyone, but he told me one night when I woke up and found him crying on the porch. It was one of the only times I ever saw him cry. He took a knife to the back and still didn't give up. Albert continued. He managed to get me out of there, took me to the hospital, and never wanted anything in return. When I tried to thank him, when I offered him money, when I offered him anything, he just said, "Take care of my Catherine, if one day I cannot." The silence in the room was absolute. Michelle had tears running down her face. Richard, leaning against the wall, looked like he was about to vomit. Albert turned to me. "Mrs. Catherine, tell me exactly what happened to your arm." For a moment, I considered lying. I considered protecting Michelle as I had done my whole life. I considered saying it was an accident, that I tripped, that I fell. But then I looked at my daughter, at that stranger who had said I deserved the lesson, who had let me starve on Christmas Eve, who was willing to throw me in a nursing home to keep my house. And the truth simply came out. I told everything. From Richard's first worried visits through the pressure to sell the house to that afternoon 3 days ago. I described how he threw me against the wall, how I heard my bone break, how I spent the whole night on the kitchen floor alone in pain while they left me there. I told about the lies they were building, about the stories that I was confused, forgetful, dangerous to myself, about the plans for legal guardianship I had discovered reviewing the papers Richard had brought for me to sign. While I spoke, I saw Albert's face transform. That mask of judicial serenity gave way to something more primitive, a controlled but intense rage that he struggled to keep under control. The 2 bodyguards remained motionless by the door, but I could see from the tension in their shoulders that they were also absorbing every word. When I finished speaking, the silence was so heavy it seemed to have physical substance. Albert remained still for a long moment, looking at the dining table as if he were calculating something in his brilliant mind. Then he moved. He walked to the chair on my right, the chair where I used to sit when George was alive, and pulled it out with a gentlemanly gesture. "Please, Mrs. Catherine," he said softly, "sit down." I sat down, confused. Albert then did something that left me speechless. He went to the center of the table himself, picked up the turkey platter, and brought it to me. He took a clean plate from the sideboard, cut the meat into small pieces, with the precision of someone who has done it many times, and placed the plate in front of me. "Eat," he said. "You need to nourish yourself." I felt the tears I had held back all night finally escape. There was the most powerful man in the state serving food to an old woman with a broken arm, while my own daughter hadn't lifted a finger to help me. I took the fork with my left hand awkwardly and began to eat. The turkey was cold, but it was the best meal I had tasted in days. Every bite seemed to restore something inside me that I thought was lost forever. Albert waited patiently until I finished. Then he turned toward Richard, who was still stuck to the wall as if he hoped it could swallow him. "You," he said, and the words sounded like a death sentence. "Come here." Richard obeyed, dragging his feet like a condemned man walking to the gallows. He stopped a few feet from Albert, avoiding looking into the judge's eyes. "You hit her," Albert said, not as a question but as a statement of fact. "You broke her arm. You left her on the kitchen floor all night, and now you sit in the chair of the man who saved my life and eat his food while she goes hungry. It was an accident." Richard tried, his voice coming out like a squeak. "She fell, I swear. I never—" "Don't lie to me." Albert's words cut the air like a knife. Richard shrank, all that arrogance from before completely evaporated. "I already sent my men to verify a few things while we were coming here," continued Albert, walking slowly around Richard like a shark circling its prey. "Interesting things about you, Richard, about your debts, about the overpriced contracts at City Hall that you helped approve, about the money that disappeared from the Public Building Maintenance Fund." Richard's face lost all color. He turned so pale I thought he was going to faint. "No." "I don't know what you are talking about," he stammered. "Yes, you do know. And you also know that with one word from me, you not only lose the job you already lost 8 months ago, but you are going to answer criminally for all of that. Embezzlement fraud. Criminal conspiracy. Not counting the assault against Mrs. Catherine, which is very well documented in her medical file." Albert stopped right in front of Richard, so close their faces were inches apart. "Do you have any idea what they do to men like you in prison? Men who beat old ladies?" Richard began to tremble. His legs gave out and he fell to his knees on the Persian rug my mother had given me when I got married. He began to cry, a ugly and pathetic cry with snot running down his nose. "Please," he begged, clasping his hands as if he were praying. "Please, I'll do anything. I'll sign anything. I didn't know. I didn't know the old woman that Mrs. Catherine was important. You thought she was a defenseless little old lady you could intimidate and rob," completed Albert. "You thought she was alone in the world." He crouched down, getting to Richard's eye level. "But she was never alone. George is gone, but the promise I made him isn't. And now you are going to pay for every drop of tear she shed because of you." Michelle, who had remained paralyzed during this whole scene, finally found her voice. "Judge, please," she said, taking a step forward. "Richard made a mistake, I know. But he is my husband. He was under pressure, the debts, the unemployment. He isn't a bad person. He was just desperate." Albert stood up slowly and turned toward my daughter. His look, which had been pure contempt until then, now carried something worse. Disappointment. "You are George's daughter," he said, and every word seemed to hurt him. "George, who risked his life for a stranger. George, who never asked for anything in return for anything. George, who raised you with everything he had." Albert shook his head. "And you married this. And the worst part, you took his side when he broke your mother's arm." Michelle opened her mouth to answer, but Albert raised his hand, silencing her. "I heard what you said a moment ago, that your mother deserved the lesson. Those were your exact words." He walked closer to her. "Do you know how many people I have sent to prison, Michelle? Hundreds. Murderers, rapists, corrupt officials. And do you know what I learned in all those years? That the worst creatures are not the ones who commit the crimes. They are the ones who watch and do nothing. They are the ones who defend the criminals. They are the ones who betray their own blood. Michelle began to cry. Not a fake cry like Richard's, but genuine tears that ran down her face, smearing her makeup, revealing the dark circles and wrinkles she tried to hide. "I didn't want to," she sobbed. "I was scared." "Richard said that." "You were afraid of your husband," interrupted Albert. "But you were not afraid to leave your mother alone on the floor with a broken arm. You were not afraid to let her go hungry. You were not afraid to help plan her legal incapacitation." He turned toward me again, his eyes, which had been hard as stone, softened. "Mrs. Catherine, the final decision is yours. What do you want me to do with them?" I looked at my daughter, at that weeping and pathetic creature who was once my little girl. I remembered when she was a baby, how she held onto my finger with her tiny hand. I remembered when she learned to walk, taking wobbly steps toward me with a smile of pure joy. I remembered when she got sick at 3 years old, and I spent sleepless nights by her bed praying for the fever to go down. Did that little girl still exist somewhere inside that woman? Then I looked at Richard, at that man who had entered my family like a parasite and had destroyed everything he touched. He had transformed my daughter into this fearful shadow. He had broken my arm and left me to starve on the floor of my own kitchen. No, for him, there was no forgiveness. But for Michelle, Albert, I said, my voice firmer than it had been in years, I want you to take Richard away. Do what you consider just with him. I never want to see this man in my life again. Richard let out a moan of despair, but no one moved to help him. And as for Michelle, asked Albert. I looked at my daughter. She looked back at me, her eyes red, her face destroyed by crying. Michelle leaves now. She is going to get out of my house, and she is not going to come back until I allow it. She will have to learn to live with the consequences of the choices she made. Mom, began Michelle. I haven't finished, I interrupted her. You chose your husband instead of your mother. You saw how he hurt me and you did nothing. You said I deserved it. Now you are going to discover what it is like to be alone with no one to defend you. Michelle sobbed harder, but I continued. But I am not like you, Michelle. I do not abandon my family. One day, perhaps, when you have learned what respect means, we can talk. But that day is not today. Albert's bodyguards moved like shadows. In seconds, Richard was on his feet, immobilized by hands that felt like iron. He tried to struggle. He screamed that he knew his rights, that this was illegal, that he was going to sue everyone. Albert didn't even dignify that with a response. He just nodded his head, and the men dragged Richard out of the living room. I heard his screams echoing down the hallway, then on the porch, and finally fading into the night when a car door slammed shut. Michelle stayed there, standing in the middle of my dining room, like a statue of salt. She looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. It wasn't anger nor defiance. It was something deeper. It was the late recognition that she had lost something precious, something she might never be able to recover. Mom, she said, her voice so weak I could barely hear it. Please, forgive me. I closed my eyes for a moment. How many times had I dreamed of hearing those words? How many nights had I spent awake, imagining the moment when Michelle would finally see the truth? But now that the moment had arrived, I felt only tiredness, a deep tiredness that went beyond my bones, beyond the pain in my broken arm. It was the exhaustion of a whole life trying to be good enough for people who never valued me. Michelle, I said, opening my eyes again. Do you know what is the worst part of all this? She shook her head, silent. The worst part isn't the broken arm. Bones heal. The worst part is knowing you were there when it happened, that you saw your husband throw me against the wall, that you heard my bone break and still you didn't help me. I was afraid of him, whispered Michelle. You don't understand what he's like, Mom. When he gets nervous? I understand perfectly, I interrupted her. I understand that you chose your fear instead of me. I understand that when the moment came to decide, you decided to protect yourself. And you know something, I could even forgive that. Fear is a powerful thing. I paused, letting the words settle. What I cannot forgive is what you said afterward. That I deserved it. That it was a lesson. That wasn't fear, Michelle. That was cruelty. Michelle began to sob again, her whole body shaking. She fell to her knees in the same spot where Richard had begged minutes before. I didn't mean that she cried. I was repeating what Richard always said. He convinced me that you were wrong, that you were stopping us from having a better life. And you believed him, I completed. You believed that your mother, who spent her whole life working to give you everything you needed, was wrong. You believed a man you have known for 10 years instead of a woman who has known you since before you were born. Albert remained silent, observing the scene with an unreadable expression. I knew he was giving me space, letting me handle this moment my way. Michelle, I said, getting up from the chair with some difficulty. Go now. Take your things and go. Where? She asked, desperate. I have nowhere to go. The apartment is in Richard's name. If he gets arrested. That is your problem now, I answered, feeling my heart shrink despite the harsh words. You are an adult. You have a degree. You have the ability to work. You will find a way, just like I found a way when your father died and you two started treating me like a nuisance. Mom, please. Albert, I said, turning to the judge, could you ask one of your men to accompany my daughter while she gathers her things? I want to make sure she doesn't take anything that isn't hers. Albert nodded. One of the bodyguards who had stayed outside entered silently and posted himself by the living room door, waiting. Michelle got up from the floor, wiping her face with her hands. Her eyes were swollen, her red dress wrinkled and stained with tears. She no longer looked like the arrogant woman who had called me a burden hours earlier. She looked like a lost child. For a moment, I almost gave in. I almost opened my arms and welcomed her, as I had done so many times before when she made a mistake and came crying, asking for forgiveness. I almost said everything was okay, that we would get through this together. But then I looked at my casted arm. I felt the dull pain that still throbbed under the plaster. I remembered the hours I spent on the kitchen floor alone, abandoned. No, not this time. Go, Michelle, I said, my voice firm despite the lump in my throat. When you are ready to be my daughter for real, you can come back, but until then, I do not want to see you. Michelle stood there for a few more seconds, as if she hoped I would change my mind. When she realized that wasn't going to happen, she lowered her head and walked toward the hallway. At the door, she stopped and turned one last time. I love you, Mom, she said, her voice choked. I know you don't believe it now, but it is true. I didn't answer. I just watched her disappear down the hallway, followed by the silent bodyguard. I heard her footsteps going up the stairs, then moving around on the floor above while she gathered her things. 15 minutes later, the front door closed, and the house fell silent. Albert walked over to me and gently held my healthy hand. You did the right thing, he said quietly. I know it hurts, but it was necessary. I felt the tears finally escape, running silently down my aged face. She is my daughter, Albert, my only daughter. I know. I carried her in my womb for 9 months. I nursed her until she was 2. I spent nights without sleeping when she got sick. I worked 2 jobs to pay for her college. And now, my voice failed. Albert said nothing. He just squeezed my hand tighter. George always said I spoiled Michelle too much. I continued after regaining control. He said I was raising a person who didn't know the value of things. I didn't listen to him. I thought he was being too hard. George was a wise man, said Albert. He was. And I didn't value that wisdom while he was alive. We stayed in silence for a moment, 2 old people sharing the weight of decades of choices and consequences. Mrs. Catherine, said Albert finally, I need to tell you something. Something George asked me to keep secret until it was necessary. I looked at him confused. Secret? What secret? Albert walked to the bookshelf in the corner of the room. It was an antique bookshelf of dark mahogany that George had built with his own hands when we got married. He ran his fingers along the spines of the books until he found a specific volume, an old encyclopedia that no one had opened for years. He pulled the book, and to my surprise, the bookshelf emitted a soft click. A section of the shelf moved slightly, revealing a hidden compartment behind the books. What is this? I asked, stepping closer. Albert pulled a brown leather folder from the compartment worn by time. There was a label on the front, written by hand with George's unmistakable handwriting. For my Catherine. George gave me this 15 years ago, explained Albert, handing me the folder. He asked me to keep it safe and only give it to you if one day you needed protection. Protection against people who wanted to take what is yours. With trembling hands, I opened the folder. What I found inside that folder completely changed my understanding of who my husband had been and the legacy he had left me. The first thing I saw was a letter written in George's neat handwriting. The letters were a little shaky, indicating he had written it when he was older, perhaps in his final years of life. "My dear Catherine," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means I have already departed and someone is trying to hurt you. Probably Michelle and that son-in-law I never trusted. Forgive me for not telling you all this while I was alive, but I was afraid you would think I was crazy, or that you would tell Michelle and she would spread it to the world." I felt a knot form in my throat as I kept reading. "You always thought I was just a truck driver, right? And I was, yes. But during 40 years driving those roads, I saw many things. I helped many people. And some of those people paid me back in ways you cannot imagine." The letter continued, explaining how George had used his savings to make small investments over the years. Nothing spectacular at first, just shares in local companies, small stakes in friends' businesses. But over time, those investments grew. "I never wanted to show off," he wrote. "I never wanted people to know we had money. I have seen many families destroyed because of inheritance, Catherine. I saw siblings fight children, sue their parents, marriages end. I didn't want that for us." I moved to the documents accompanying the letter: bank statements, deeds, stock certificates. The numbers danced before my eyes, but even with my vision blurred by tears, I could understand the essential part. George had left me a fortune. Not just this house, which I knew was worth a lot because of the land, but also an apartment in the city center rented to a law firm, a small ranch in the countryside leased for soybean farming stakes in 3 different companies and bank accounts that added up to an amount that made me sit abruptly in the nearest chair. How I whispered, unable to form a complete sentence. How did I not know anything about this? "George was a very discreet man," answered Albert, sitting in the chair beside me. "He managed everything through proxies and shell companies. He never wanted it to appear as his property directly. But why? Why hide this from me?" Albert hesitated before answering. "Because he knew his daughter, Mrs. Catherine, and he knew your son-in-law. He knew that if Michelle discovered you had money, she would want it. And if she wanted it, she would pressure you, and you, with the soft heart you have, would end up giving in." Those words hurt, but I knew they were true. How many times had I given money to Michelle just because she asked? How many times had I paid her bills, lent her money without expecting her to pay it back, helped her in emergencies that I later discovered were unnecessary luxuries? If I had known I had all this, I probably would have already given her half. "There is something else," said Albert, pointing to the end of the folder. "Look at the last document." I looked until I found what he was pointing at. It was a donation deed dated 8 years ago. The deed transferred this house, the house where I lived, to a charitable foundation linked to the General Hospital. For a moment, I didn't understand. If the house had been donated, how was I still living in it? Then I read the clauses more carefully. The donation would only become effective after my death. As long as I lived, I had the right of lifetime use of the property. No one could take me out of here. No one could sell it. No one could do anything with this property while I breathed. "George did this on purpose," explained Albert. "He knew that Michelle and Richard's greatest weapon would be the threat of legal incapacitation. If they managed to declare you incompetent, they could take control of your assets and sell everything. But with this conditional donation deed, the house is protected. Even if someone manages to incapacitate you legally, they cannot touch the property." I closed my eyes, feeling the tears run freely now. George, my George. Even after death, he was still protecting me. He was still one step ahead of those who wanted to hurt me. "There is one more thing I need to tell you," said Albert, his voice more serious now. "About Richard." I opened my eyes and looked at him. "My men found some interesting things when they started investigating your son-in-law, things that go beyond debts and fraudulent contracts." He paused as if choosing his words carefully. "Richard was involved with loan sharks. Dangerous people, Mrs. Catherine. People who don't play around when the money is late. He owed more than $200,000 to these people. I felt my stomach sink. $200,000. And he was running out of options. The loan sharks had already given him an ultimatum. Either he paid before the end of the month, or they were going to collect in other ways. Albert looked me directly in the eyes. That is why he was so desperate to get your house. It wasn't just greed, it was survival. He intended to sell everything you had and flee the country before those people came for him. The magnitude of what Richard had planned began to reveal itself in all its horrible clarity. It wasn't just about sending me to a nursing home and keeping my assets. It was about liquidating everything in a hurry, taking the money and disappearing. And I, old and alone in a cheap nursing home, would be left behind with nothing, with no one. And Michelle, I asked, almost afraid of the answer. Did she know about all this? Albert shook his head. We aren't sure. But from the conversations we intercepted, it seems she didn't know the extent of the debts nor the escape plans. Richard manipulated her as much as he manipulated you. He told her half-truths, made her believe you were being difficult for no reason. I don't know why, but that information brought me a small relief. It didn't absolve Michelle of her choices, but at least it meant she wasn't completely evil, just weak. Weak and easily manipulated, as George always said. What is going to happen to him now? I asked. Richard will answer for assault, attempted fraud, and embezzlement. Depending on what we find in the investigation, he might spend several years in prison. Albert paused. And the loan sharks will probably discover where he is. In prison or out of it, the debt doesn't disappear. I should have felt satisfaction with that justice, revenge, whatever it was. But all I felt was an immense tiredness, a sadness that went beyond my broken arm, beyond the betrayal of my daughter, beyond everything. Albert, I said quietly, can you do me a favor? Whatever it is, Mrs. Catherine. Will you leave me alone now? I need to think to process all this. He nodded, standing up. Of course. I will leave one of my men outside just as a precaution. If you need anything, just call. I walked him to the door. Before leaving, he turned one last time. Mrs. Catherine, George was right about you. You are stronger than you look, and you deserve much more than you have received. After he left, I went back to the living room. The table was still set, the remains of the cold turkey in the center, the dirty plates in the places where Richard and Michelle had sat. I sat in my spot, the spot that had been mine for 45 years, and looked around. The walls covered in photographs, the sideboard with the wedding china, the grandfather clock marking the seconds with unshakable precision. This was my house, my life, my story, and no one was going to take that away from me. The months that followed that Christmas Eve were months of rebuilding, not just of my arm, which healed slowly under the cast and later needed physical therapy, but of my whole life. With the help of Albert and the lawyers he recommended, I managed to organize the financial mess Richard had left behind. I discovered he had tried to obtain loans using my name as a guarantor, but since the documents were never truly signed by me, we managed to annul everything. Richard's trial was quick and without surprises. With the evidence Albert's investigators had gathered, plus my testimony and the medical report of my broken arm, he was sentenced to 6 years in prison. I learned later that in prison he had some problems with other inmates. It seems the loan sharks had long arms even behind bars. I didn't feel pity. Maybe I should have, but I couldn't. That man had hurt me in ways that went far beyond a broken arm. He had made me doubt the love of my own daughter. He had transformed my house into a battlefield. He had made me feel for the first time in my life that I was a nuisance, a burden, an inconvenience. As for Michelle, things were more complicated. In the first few months, she tried to contact me several times. She called the landline, which I left on voicemail. She sent letters which I read but didn't answer. She appeared at the door of the house twice, but I didn't open it. It wasn't easy. Every time I heard her voice on the answering machine, every time I recognized the handwriting on the envelope, my heart shrank. She was my daughter, my only daughter. The mother instinct screamed at me to forgive, to open my arms, to pretend nothing had happened. But I couldn't. Not yet. Because forgiving her without her truly understanding what she had done would simply be repeating the cycle. It would be putting myself back in the position of a doormat of a person who accepts anything in exchange for crumbs of affection. And I had already done that for too long. The change began to happen after about 5 months. Michelle's messages started changing tone. At first they were full of empty apologies and justifications. I was confused. Richard manipulated me. You don't understand the pressure I was feeling. Always blaming something external, never truly assuming responsibility. But little by little, the messages became different. One letter in particular marked me. It arrived on a rainy day, almost 6 months after that Christmas Eve. I was on the porch drinking coffee and looking at the rose garden George had planted when Mrs. Linda, my neighbor, brought me the envelope. "This came for you, Mrs. Catherine," she said with that curious look she always had when the subject involved my daughter. I took the letter and waited for her to leave to open it. Michelle's handwriting was different, more shaky, as if she had cried while writing. "Mom, I know you probably aren't going to read this just like you didn't read the other letters. But I need to write, even if it is only for myself. These months away from you have been the worst of my life. Not because of the money or the apartment I lost or the difficulties I am going through. They have been the worst because for the first time I had to look at myself for real without Richard to tell me what to think, without excuses to hide behind. And what I saw was horrible. I saw a woman who left her own mother on the floor with a broken arm, a woman who took her husband's side when he hurt you, a woman who said you deserved it. How could I do that, Mom? How did I become that person? I'm going to therapy now. I don't have money, but I got a spot in a community center with free psychological support. The psychologist is helping me understand how I was molded by Richard over the years, how he isolated me, making me doubt myself, convincing me that you were the problem. But do you know what she told me that hurt the most? She told me that Richard's manipulation only worked because I allowed it, because it was easier to believe him than to face the truth. Because I was a coward. She is right. I was a coward, Mom. I was a coward when I saw him push you and I did nothing. I was a coward when I left you alone on the floor. I was a coward when I repeated his words as if they were mine. I am not asking you for forgiveness. Not yet. I don't deserve it. I am just telling you this because you need to know that I finally understood. Not with my head, which is easy. I understood with my heart. I hurt you. I chose wrong. And I will spend the rest of my life trying to be a better person. If one day you want to see me again, I will be waiting. With love, even if you don't believe it. Michelle. I read the letter 3 times. By the 3rd time, I was crying so much I could barely distinguish the letters. I didn't answer immediately. I kept the letter together with the others in a box I had in the bedroom closet. But something had changed. A crack had opened in the wall I had built around my heart. In the following weeks, more letters arrived. Michelle kept writing even without an answer. She told me about therapy, about the job she had gotten as an assistant in a pharmacy, about the small rented room where she lived now. She never asked me for money. She never asked to come back. She just shared her life as if she wanted to show me she was trying to change. It was a Sunday afternoon, almost a year after that Christmas Eve, that I finally made a decision. I picked up the phone and dialed the number Michelle had left in one of the letters. She answered on the 2nd ring, her voice full of hope and fear. "Mom, Michelle," I said, feeling my heart beat strong. "Are you free next Sunday? I wanted to invite you to lunch." The silence on the other end lasted only a few seconds, but it seemed like an eternity. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of someone trying to hold back tears. "I will be free," she managed to say. "I will be free, yes. Then come here to the house at noon. I am going to make a pot roast just like your grandmother made." "Mom." Her voice failed. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," I said, trying to maintain firmness despite the lump in my throat. "We have a lot to talk about. It is going to be difficult. But it is a start." "It is a start," she repeated. It is all I needed to hear. When I hung up the phone, I stood in the middle of the living room for a long time, looking at George's photo on the shelf. He was smiling in that photo, an open and genuine smile I knew so well. "You were right about her," I whispered to the photo. "She was lost, but I think she is finding her way back." The grandfather clock struck 3 in the afternoon. The same clock that had witnessed Albert's arrival that Christmas Eve. The same clock that had marked every second of my life in that house. For the first time in a long time, the tick-tock didn't seem like a countdown to something bad. It seemed like an invitation to a new beginning. 2 years passed since that first reunion lunch with Michelle. 2 years of difficult conversations, of tears of old anger, finally being released. 2 years of slow and careful reconstruction of a relationship that was almost destroyed forever. It wasn't easy. There were moments when I wanted to give up, when the resentment returned with full force, and I asked myself if it was really worth trying. There were arguments, uncomfortable silences, Sundays when one of us left before lunch was over. But there was also progress, small at first, then growing larger. Michelle proved to me that she was truly changing. She continued in therapy even when she got a better job and could have stopped. She never asked me for money again, even when I offered help. She never tried to tell me what to do with my life or my house again. And most importantly, she began to see me. Not as an obstacle, not as a source of resources, but as a person, as her mother. Today is Christmas again. The table is set with the same white embroidered tablecloth, the same porcelain plates, the same candles I light every year. The turkey is in the center, golden and aromatic, surrounded by all the delicious things that are part of our family tradition. But many things have changed. Michelle is sitting to my left, helping serve the plates. She wears a simple navy blue dress, and her hair is natural now, undyed. She is thinner, more mature, with some wrinkles around her eyes that weren't there 2 years ago. Wrinkles of worry, of struggle, of growth. Beside her is Michael, a quiet and gentle man she met at the church she started attending. He is a widower, has 2 teenage sons, and looks at Michelle as if she were the most precious thing in the world. Not the gleam of possession I saw in Richard's eyes, but the gleam of genuine respect. Albert is also here, sitting in the place that was George's. He comes to visit me regularly now, and our friendship has deepened over these 2 years. It isn't a romance, nothing like that. We are just 2 old people sharing stories and memories of people we loved. And me, I am sitting in my usual chair with my 2 hands functioning perfectly. The arm healed completely, leaving only a small scar in the place where the bone fractured. A scar that reminds me every day of what happened, but also of what I survived. I look around the table, and I feel something I thought I would never feel in this house again. Peace. Mom, says Michelle, interrupting my thoughts. "Can I make a toast?" I nod, raising my glass of grape juice. Albert and Michael do the same. Michelle stands up, holding her glass with a slightly trembling hand. Her eyes find mine, and I see in them something that had disappeared for a long time. Genuine love without interest, without calculation. I want to give thanks. She begins, her voice choked, to thank my mother for giving me a second chance, for not giving up on me even when I deserved it, for showing me that true love includes boundaries. She pauses, swallowing the lump in her throat. 2 years ago, I almost destroyed the most important person in my life. I almost lost my mother because I was weak, because I was a coward, because I let a bad man convince me that she was the problem. I have carried that weight every day since then, and I will keep carrying it, because that is what reminds me never to make the same mistake again. A tear slides down her face, but she doesn't stop speaking. Mom, you taught me the most important lesson of my life. You taught me that you reap what you sow, that choices have consequences, and that asking for forgiveness isn't enough. We have to show with actions that we changed. She raises the glass. So this toast is to you, Mom, to your strength, to your courage, to your ability to love, even after being hurt so badly. I love you, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to deserve that love. We all raise our glasses. The clinking of the crystal resonates in the room, mixing with the familiar tick-tock of the grandfather clock. After the toast, Michelle comes toward me and hugs me. A strong hug, like she hasn't given me since she was a little girl. I feel her tears wet my shoulder and mine wet hers. "I forgive you," I whisper in her ear, truly, completely. She sobs harder, holding on to me as if I were her anchor. When we finally separate, I look around the room one more time. At the abundant table, at the beloved faces at the walls covered in memories. George was right about many things. About Richard, about the risks of showing off wealth, about the importance of preparing for the worst. But there was one thing he was wrong about. He believed Michelle was lost forever. That greed and weakness had consumed the girl we raised. But she came back. Hurt transformed, marked by the experience. But she came back. And that in the end is the true meaning of family. It isn't blood, it isn't obligation, It isn't what society expects. It is the ability to get lost and find yourself again. It is the courage to admit mistakes and work to repair them. It is the love that persists even when everything seems broken beyond repair. My arm healed. My relationship with Michelle healed. My faith in humanity, which had been so shaken that Christmas Eve also healed. And while the grandfather clock marks the hours and the smell of roasted turkey fills the air, I finally understand the last lesson George left me. It wasn't the hidden fortune. It wasn't the properties, the investments, the financial safety net. The true inheritance he left me was the courage to defend myself, to demand respect, to set boundaries, even when that meant pushing away the people I loved most. Because only when I learned to value myself could Michelle learn to value me too. And that is the most precious Christmas gift I could receive. Now, if you like this story, click subscribe and tell me in the comments which part left you with your mouth open. Oh, and don't forget to become a member to have access to exclusive videos that I don't post here. I will see you there.